Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York.
Hey, it's Brother Michael RC, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com. Just a quick reminder, you can now listen early and ad-free to new episodes with our new subscriber offer. Get the link to start your 7-day free trial in the show notes and on our website, CraftsmanOnline.com. You've joined us for an episode on the 300th anniversary of the Anderson's Constitutions, and he's already promised to drop some knowledge that may not be popular with some people. As we welcome back Right Worshipful Brother Samuel Lloyd Kinsey, who's the chairman of the Custodians of the Work of the Grand Lodge of New York. Welcome back to the podcast, Brother Sam.
All right, happy to be here.
You know, we bring you back here for those opinions. I like when ancient ideas get challenged by modern men, especially modern men with a drink in the hand. That's a good thing. One of the things that impresses me most about your leadership roles, you're a past master, an AGL, district deputy grand master, now, as we mentioned, the current chairman of the Custodians of the Work for the Grand Lodge. How do you summarize the significance of these Anderson's Constitutions that we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of?
I think it's really the first widely published document that, consolidated the various kinds of legendary histories and charges and regulations and all these sorts of things that had existed up to that time and are usually called something like the old charges in the Gothic constitutions. And, different lodges would have different ones, right? So this kind of put everything together. More than just being a collection, I think the authors, they sort of cherry picked the parts that they liked and they expanded or changed things as they saw fit. And I think they also replaced some parts, with material that they thought was better, right? The statement on religion in particular, which we'll get into in a minute. This was the first document that really sort of standardized those things across a broad number of lodges. And I don't think it would really be inaccurate to say that the history of our Masonic system, sort of from the early 18th century till at least the middle of the 19th century, was sort of one of regularizing the craft, making sure that we had a shared vocabulary and shared elements in our ceremonies and modes of recognitions and landmarks and those sorts of things. And that was a primary goal of Grand Lodge Masonry, right? You have a Grand Lodge, they're sort of setting some standards. And that we see the same thing today in the fact that we have a standard work and lectures in our jurisdiction. And it's interesting to note that right around that time in 1730, right, this famous Exposure of Masonry Dissected was published, which was bought, basically by Masons who used it as a kind of de facto ritual guide, and that sort of standardized a lot of those customs and practices across the craft. So I think, both of those things had an effect of introducing some standardization across the craft.
I like that you started getting to the timeline, because we're looking at 1717 is when the Grand Lodge of England, UGL as we call it, came into existence, where these lodges came together and finally publicly proclaimed and kind of revealed this, hey, we exist, we're Masons, we're in your society, we're in your community. And then in 1723, this guy Anderson is charged or asked to write these constitutions. Why was it him? And then what made that period of time so significant, as you're saying, to kind of standardize or try to codify Freemasonry at that moment? What was going on in the world?
That's an interesting question. I would say sort of right off the bat, and this may be the controversial thing, the opinion, I don't know. It's not entirely clear to me that Anderson wrote all that much of it himself, right? I mean, he was given the job of writing a history. And, there's other stuff in there, Grandmaster so-and-so's way of constituting a lodge, Payne's regulations, these charges, which a lot of people thought were written by Desaguliers. It may be that he sort of ghost wrote a lot of that stuff. The really big, I think, impact that it had, and it's possible that he was the one to sort of introduce this, is, some of the charges, and in particularly what he has to say about religion, right? We're coming off of a period of about 300 years when people had been going around Europe cutting each other's heads off over what, we would today think were fairly minor thoughts about how religion should be. So, and that actually really changed what had been the practice of Masonry up to that point, right? I mean, he effectively just says that, it doesn't matter what religion you practice, you can subscribe to any denomination or persuasion as long as it's that religion in which all good men agree. And really, prior to that time, the old charges in the Gothic constitutions had been overtly Christian. The Regis manuscript, says Christ teaches us, blah, 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 right? I mean, that you can't get more Christian than that. And even more specifically, you have some of these ones. There's something called the Grand Lodge manuscript in 1853. And this is going really all the way to a manuscript called the Old Constitutions in 1722. So just a year prior. And they all have some version of a thing saying, the might of the Father in heaven and the wisdom of the glorious Son, through the grace of God and the goodness of the Holy Ghost, that are three persons in one God. So you don't have to just be a Christian, you have to be a Trinitarian Christian. That's a pretty big deal when you view that through the lens of 300 years of people, kind of shoving their version of, let's be honest here, Christianity down the throats of other people, whether or not that throat was still attached to a head.
Right.
And that's one of the bedrock principles of Freemasonry today. So to me, in terms of like the most radical thing that these constitutions did was that.
Is it fair to say, and I don't want to spend too much time getting into the history of Freemasonry or the coming out of the first, known Grand Lodge, but I think it is relevant to kind of talk about this moment, is that basically what you had up until this point was the Pope saying Catholics really can't be Freemasons, and you had churches and state. There wasn't really this division. The church the Church of England was what everybody had to follow if you wanted to keep, as you say, your head on your neck. And then around 1717, this idea of, hey, other sects of this same faith can now be accepted. But up until that point, a Masonic lodge may have been somewhere where men valued each other, of having these different beliefs and having these different backgrounds. And as we would call it now, like, it was quote unquote kind of a safe space for men to just come together that were like-minded and connect. And really putting this down on paper with the Anderson's Constitution and sharing it with the rest of the world was really starting to begin to proclaim Freemasonry's values.
Yeah, I mean, I think the proclaiming part and the sort of setting the path for what came afterwards was definitely a thing. To whatever extent we had, religiously diverse lodges prior to 1723, I don't know. Right. I mean, I do know that particular charge that was controversial in the craft. There were people who were like, oh, hold on, wait a second here. You mean we're going to have to accept people that are this kind of Presbyterian and not this kind of Presbyterian? I don't know if I'm okay with that. And I think that certainly set the stage for things that were to come. And obviously now, right, religious diversity and ecumenicism is one of the bedrock principles of Freemasonry.
Continues to this day. I mean, it's amazing going into a lodge in our jurisdiction, and you'll see many volumes of sacred law or sacred texts on the altar as part, if a brother wants to bring it and have a place there, which, sad to say, probably 300 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to see something like that.
Hey, man, I've been present when guys have been obligated on Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law.
Wow. Talk about diversity. So who was James Anderson? Why was he kind of selected to do this job, to have his name or being referred to as the Anderson's Constitution? I don't think it's fair to put him in like the same class as like a George Washington as a historical Masonic figure, or is it? Is he just a guy that was chosen because he was known for being a great writer?
I mean, it is interesting that we call it Anderson's Constitutions because he's not listed on either the 1723 one or the 1738 version as the author. I mean, if you go to the back of the book, there's sort of a list of worshipful masters that kind of say, oh, we subscribe to this. And, at some point in little print, it says James Anderson, comma, author of this work. I think that he knew these people, but I think among all of the figures that came to be prominent in the early years of the Premier Grand Lodge, he really had the least amount of prestige and juice and connections. He was a Scottish Presbyterian minister. And as a Scot, by the way, I would just like to point out the crucial importance of Scotsmen in the development of Masonry. William Preston, not for nothing. And he later on became a Grand Warden. And sure, he was good at writing and he had time on his hands. And I think that he wanted to do it. And I don't know that it has to be any more complicated than that. I mean, it is interesting. So, for example, right, Payne's regulations, we don't know what those were other than what's in the Anderson Constitutions, right? Presumably, they were written out by Grandmaster Payne, and that Anderson either put them in there exactly the way they were or changed some stuff, or we don't know, or maybe he didn't even write it. We don't know.
How much would you love listening to this podcast without having to hear one of these? The annoying commercial, not just before the podcast that you can kind of skip over, but the ones in the middle where, dude, you're just trying to listen to what we're talking about. Well, we've launched our Patreon membership, which gives you a chance to listen to our podcast early and ad-free. So we cut out these annoying commercials. Plus, you get to hear weekly episodes before the regular listeners do. My favorite part, and I pay $5 a month just for this myself, is to get the extra time episodes. Like, I can guarantee you on this discussion with Right Worshipful Samuel Lloyd Kinsey, we're going to get some bonus time to talk about the Anderson's Constitutions. And a little tease, we're probably going to get into some of the symbolism that's around it as well. All this costs just $5 a month. It's a great way to support our show. All of the help goes to pay for the production costs that are associated with putting out our weekly Craftsman Online podcast. You can start your free 7-day trial right now by clicking the link in the show notes for this episode. Try it out. If you think it's worth $5, we thank you in advance for your support. Let's travel back to 1723. We started talking about the three sections of the Anderson's Constitutions. And you had kind of pointed out, he really focused on one area, which you and I have talked about a little bit in a previous episode when it comes to the origins of Freemasonry as Noahides, which is the followers of the 7 laws of Noah. Can you tell us about the meaning of these laws and how they were relevant during Anderson's time?
Well, that's an interesting thing. And what you're talking about actually is not in the 1723 constitutions. It's in the 1738 constitutions. Like pretty much everything that's in that history, there's no evidence that was ever really the case.
Okay.
And it almost certainly was just completely invented by Anderson, like most of the stuff that's in there. If you look at the sort of old legends that were in the Gothic constitutions and the old charges, they typically were in 3 sections. A bunch of regulations, and then they would talk about the liberal arts and sciences, and then there would be a section in there giving some sort of legendary history, which anachronistically usually involved some version of Euclid going into Africa and learning geometry from Abraham, and then bringing that to the British Isles and teaching it as masonry. And so, Anderson took a lot of liberties and put a lot of stuff in there that's not in any of the supposed source documents that he used to compile this stuff from. The Noahides, or however that's pronounced, probably not that way. There's no evidence that was ever really a big part of Masonry, as far as I can tell. And I'll be honest with you, that's kind of a bummer to me, because my lodge was founded by ship captains and Sandy Hook pilots, and we like anything that associates Masonry with seafaring men. The seven laws, which are not, I don't believe, are actually described in the constitutions, comes from Talmudic interpretations of the biblical text, and they have things to do with, idolatry, cursing God, not murdering people, not committing adultery, and all those sorts of things. And I want to be very clear here. I'm by no means a biblical or Talmudic scholar in any sense of the word. With the small amount of knowledge that I have, I think is pretty important in the practice of Judaism, that you should adhere to those things. But relevance to the British Isles in 1723, I don't know that they had any particularly noteworthy relevance.
So why do you think in the Euclid, I hadn't heard that before. So that's interesting. I'm just grasping at straws here, but was like this kind of his attempt for maybe the early Hiramic legend, the explanation of and his personal view of where the craft originated from, or could be first traced back to?
He goes all the way back. Adam taught geometry to Cain, of all people. That seems like a strange choice. He goes all the way back to Cain, and then traces that through all of the various characters and ages that are described in the Bible, and then goes over to include most of the significant sovereigns and other figures in Europe. And then, of course, it goes over to the British Isles, and of course, every king, was a Mason. And I don't think it was ever really meant to be believed. Maybe. I mean, I will say that, and it's actually when I counsel lodges on that are trying to do a revitalization, and I think can be very valuable for a lodge to have unique traditions that only they do. Right? It's a good way to have pride. It's a good way to make the Masonic experience more interesting for the members. And one of the things that I say is, look, if you do something for 5 years in a row and you tell people you've always been doing it, at the end of 5 years, it's true. There's all kinds of things where people have this belief that Freemasonry somehow derived from the Templars. There's a great book called The Rosslyn Hoax, pretty much just completely debunks that, because they can trace it directly to appearing for the first time in, I think we can call them another faux history. Hey, man, somebody wrote it 300 years ago, and now people think it's true. I think we can, with fairly good confidence, say that it's highly unlikely that Adam taught geometry as Masonry to Cain. I'm just guessing.
Yeah. Of the two, that would be the least likely person that he would have had that conversation with. Anderson has a thing for Noah, just an unexplainable man crush, as we would say today, on Noah, which is fine.
He's a Noah stan, I guess they would say, right?
Yeah, he's Team Noah. You going through and reading the 1723 constitutions and then the 1738 constitutions, what parts of that either interested you or maybe raised a level of intrigue in you?
I really find it interesting that, for example, the way that we install our officers, or that the Grand Master installs the officers of a new lodge, is really not that different from how it was done back then. And by the way, I find it interesting that fundamentally the charges and regulations, many of which are read to the master when he's installed in, we call them the ancient charges and regulations. Isn't that interesting? I find it interesting that people were able to come up with things that were far-reaching and sort of forward-thinking in a way. Obviously, the thing about religion is hugely important. And whoever it was who came up with that, I find that fascinating. In terms of, for example, persistence of things through Masonry, through a succession of ages, as we like to say, is something that I find fascinating and interesting. I actually give a talk about how you can look at certain elements of our ritual And if you kind of know what you're looking at, it makes this sort of 300-year roadmap of Masonic history and practice.
I want to get to that because I found just in some of the summaries that I read and some of the study that I did of the 1723 constitutions that you keep talking about the religious part, but they would have been viewed as just I want to say the word radical at that time because they really conflicted with where society was when it came to religion and culture, especially early in the 18th century. I kind of started to get the idea or the opinion that some of the democratic viewpoints, not talking politics, but just the democratic viewpoints that were proposed in 1723 could have been part of that gunpowder that lit the charge for the American revolutionists to stand up against the crown and declare that they wanted to be, free citizens. This was all right around that boiler time in the history of the world. Do you kind of find or share that opinion as well?
Yes, in some places, and I think that also no in some places, right? I mean, one of the first, I think it's one of the charges, but maybe it's one of the regulations, and it doesn't really matter, is all about how you're supposed to be a peaceable citizen and obey the civil magistrates, right? And that certainly goes against what happened around here in 1776. And P.S., it kind of goes against like the civil rights movement and certain kinds of protesting.
January 6th, for example, most recently. Yeah.
There's parts of it that really brought us forward and that I think were these forward thinking things. And then I think there was other stuff that was not so forward thinking, but hey, what do you expect from somebody in 1723? I do find it interesting that there were certainly a lot of the people that were intimately involved in the, really it's not a revolution because we didn't take over England, really a war of secession, that the majority of those guys were Freemasons. And I think that the Declaration of Independence and the constitutions can be viewed as at their core Masonic documents. I do find it interesting that to this day, we have parts of our rituals and ceremonies that tell us to be peaceable citizens and obey the laws of our country and give a proper respect to the civil authorities. Personally, I've always thought that a one word change would make that more relevant, which is to say that you are going to obey the just laws of your country, but maybe not the unjust ones.
It also leaves that gray area, the wiggle room for the individual to decide what's just and unjust, or do you go with what the community standards are, or the majority, so to speak? But I do, and to keep coming back to this religious point, is that I find it interesting in the 1723 constitutions is that they firmly, as you point out, they had their foot planted in some of the traditions that they wanted to keep moving forward that we have still embraced today. But then there was just this one point where they're like, hey, but we feel that religion should be open to more faiths, different viewpoints. Did they refer in the constitutions as to God, or was he referred to as deity, or they referred to as the supreme architect of the universe or grand architect of the universe, or any of the other common phrases that Masons may hear now?
Honestly, I don't know. I have a feeling like the word God is said. Great architect of the universe, interestingly enough, is a phraseology that was popularized by, of all people, John Calvin. Yeah, that dour Scotsman. What's not in there is Jesus. And it's I think probably unknowable, but it would be very interesting to know what the thinking was behind that. I think it's possible that they maybe handed the charges to Anderson and sort of said, hey, pretty these up.
Right. And then you also have a guy who's a fan of Noah, going back to that point, that he might be more of an Old Testament leaning brother. So,
but on the other hand, he's a minister. That's a very interesting thing, but in some ways, maybe the most important thing that's in there.
we did this episode, and thank you so much for coming on again as we kind of salute the celebration that's going on for the 300th anniversary of the 1723 constitutions, as we've learned, also known as the Andersons, written by him, small print. If there's anything that you'd want our listener to take away from our discussion tonight, or just the interest that you have in it, what is that one thought that you'd want to leave a brother Mason or just someone interested in Freemasonry when it comes to this historic document?
I would say the same thing about this that I would say about some other important kind of foundational Masonic documents. And the two that really come to mind is Spirit of Masonry. And then the other one is by Calcott. I forget what his first name is, but it's really Wellens Calcott. And it's actually called A Candid Disquisition of the Principles and Practices of the Most Ancient and Honorable, blah, 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 blah. And it's just as boring as it sounds. Calcott and Hutchinson basically invented symbolic Masonry as we know it today. There's a lot of stuff that you can find out where it came from if you read those books. The Calcott book, for example, has a big thing in there about fetus. I mean, because where does that come from, right? And right after he finishes saying a long thing about fetus, in passing, he sort of says, oh, there's also this stuff in the Book of Ruth. How did that get in there, right? So, and I would say the same thing about these constitutions. It is boring. I don't think there's any getting around that. This stuff is not a captivating read. And it's also true that most of the versions of it that you can find, like online or whatever, are scans of something that's written in this oldie-timey script where the S's all look like F's. I'm not going to kid anybody about that. This is not a page turner. But there is interesting stuff to see in there. And if you've ever wondered, why do we do this and where did it come from? And why do we say this? That the Constitutions is a book that I would recommend that somebody read. Just slog through it. It's going to be worth it.
This has been the Craftsman Online Podcast. Big thanks again to Right Worshipful Samuel Lloyd Kinsey, the chairman of the Custodians of the Work for the Grand Lodge of New York, for joining us once again. Thanks for coming on, Brother Sam. If you've enjoyed this podcast and you want to hear some more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online Podcast. We're available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or CraftsmanOnline.com.